And now the meeting is being recorded. So welcome, Linda Urban. Now I'm going to stop sharing, and that will leave our Adobe Connect window open for Linda to share.
Okay. Thanks, Vicki, for that introduction. And hopefully you're seeing my screen. Is that true?
I see you.
Great.
And your smiling face.
Okay, and I've got a weird little bit of Adobe Connect stuff here as I try to shift things around. So thanks, and thanks everybody for making time today and joining us. And I'd, let's see if we can get my system to work correctly. So Vicki just told you really a little bit about me, and after a lot of years as a technical communicator and instructional designer doing deliverables, I've shifted more to working with teams and teaching. I still sometimes get in and actually do the development, but more often that's part of working with teams. And so that's been a shift for me and one that I'm really enjoying. And I'd like to get a sense, before we really get started, about who's here. I know some of your names, and some of you I know a little better than others, but if you could just type in chat the role that you think of yourself as having, whether it's a technical writer, a course developer, an instructional designer, e-learning developer, trainer, something else. If you're a consultant who wears many hats, that would be useful to know also.
I'm not seeing anything, guys.
Okay, so we've got trainers.
Excuse me, can anybody hear me?
Yes.
This is Jamie. I don't see anything on my screen at all, nothing.
Hi, Jamie. Are other people seeing slides?
I mean, I hear y'all perfectly, but I don't see any slides.
Okay, so Nina sees fine. Amy sees fine. Okay, so did you actually click through into Adobe Connect, Jamie?
I never, well, I went ahead and went through another link, but I don't have if there's another link I can access because I didn't see anything in my ticket.
Okay, so there should have been a link to follow that would launch Adobe Connect, and it'll open in a little separate window for you.
Okay, I guess I'll go back. That's in the email when I registered, right?
No.
You should have gotten an email. Go ahead.
Yeah, you should have gotten an email at 12:15 my time. So that would have been an hour and 15 minutes ago.
Okay.
And
I wonder if it was through I'll check my personal email. It may have gone through there instead of my work email.
However you registered.
Okay.
Jamie, are you seeing an Adobe Connect window? Because I can type the link in right there.
Let's see. Here we go. I'm sorry. Let's see. Yeah, it was on my other email. Sorry.
That's okay. Are you set now?
I should be. Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And if you're if you can mute your phone, that would probably be helpful, just so that we can avoid any feedback. Thanks, and we'll give people a. So we've got some raised hands, by the way. Are those with questions, or are those leftovers? And Vicki, is it possible to clear them so we'll just know when they're actually new?
I think so.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
This is new for me. Thank you.
Yeah, we were just starting to hear from people about their backgrounds, and it looks like we've got some many-headed consultants, as well as some people who focus on technical training, software implementation trainer, tech writer and ID consultant. Okay, so just out of curiosity, if you work on staff rather than being an Outside consultant, could you raise your hand? Okay, a couple people on staff. So it looks like we've got a few consultants and a couple people on staff as well. Great. Nice mix. Okay. And I think this is probably a fairly established group of people in terms of the names that I see, but would any of you sort of put yourself in the less experienced category, say 0 to 2 years? That would be helpful to know. Right. Betty and Nina, 15 years plus. Not surprised. Jamie, a little less, but still pretty experienced. Yep, pretty established group. That's what I was anticipating. 7 years in TechCom 2 and training, James. Okay, good. Yep, making that transition. Good to know. Okay, so you saw the blurb clearly for this webinar, and before we get too far into it, I would love to just sort of hear what you were hoping for. So you saw a little bit of description, you saw the link, maybe you were thinking, maybe she'll cover this, I'm interested in this, or, well, I need the information about evaluation because of this. So your hopes and expectations for this webinar, that would be really interesting for me to know. And you could just type in chat. If anybody would prefer to speak, feel free to raise your hand, and we can also capture, bring your voice into the room. Okay, and I'm going to copy some of these in from chat. To show a client how I'll measure success of materials. Yep. Okay, better evaluation questions. Materials actually accomplish their goals. Yep. I see James and Robert are typing. Okay, develop and deliver training and would like to know how to get things across appropriately. And evaluation concepts that are new, okay? Anything else occurring to you? So I'd like to get an idea at the beginning. Other things may bubble up to you as we're going along that occur to you. So if you have questions, please do type them in chat. As I start talking, I'm probably going to occasionally lose track of the chat. So if I do, we'll come back to it later. And if there's anything really critical, I'm going to ask Vicki to feel free to interrupt if it seems like there's something I'm not seeing that should be part of the conversation right then. And if it's a bit on a tangent, I may ask you to hold off and come back to it later. But thank you for these, and let me just comment on them before I sort of move through the slides that we have for today. So to show a client how I'll measure success of training materials and training activities. So we're definitely going to be talking about things to think about. We won't get a lot into the actual measure part, but things to think about to make sure you're headed in the right direction, and how can you know. Better evaluation questions. Betty, I hope you'll get some ideas for that, although we're not particularly focused on questions per se. I hope some of the ideas will help. And although what we're going to be talking about could apply to any kind of a training or learning situation, or potentially even a TechCom situation, certainly I hope it will apply to webinars and e-learning. Accomplishing their goals, that's very much the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. How do you know if what you're developing is actually helping down the road? in terms of development, learning how to best get things across appropriately, we're going to be less focused on the development piece, but I hope that you'll get some ideas about how to think about what's in your training and really tie it to goals that may be useful. And definitely I think we're probably going to be hitting some concepts. And you can tell me at the end, actually, Robert, whether they're actually new to you or ones that, is more sort of filling in the gaps. We got a lot of experience and in the room and a lot of exposure to different things over time. So to some extent, I suspect that this conversation will be getting sort of a sense of filling in the gaps and of what people already know. Okay, just going to capture just a few more that I see in the chat. Future training through evaluating existing training. Yes, very useful and very, very important thing to do. So thank you for that. So evaluation can mean a lot of things in different contexts. So let me just capture again a little bit. When you think about it, what does it mean to you? Did X accomplish Y? An end process? Were the goals met? Okay, objective and subjective. Vicki, could you say a little bit more about what that means to you?
Okay, I have to unmute myself. Well, people who attend my training, they walk away hopefully feeling confident, but there must be some way to get an objective reading on that rather than just saying, well, I tend to ask people, on a scale from 1 to 10, do you feel at least above a 5 that you could do this on your own? And I won't let them leave the room unless they are able to answer above a 5. But there must be a better way than just sort of asking them for their impression.
Yes. Very good point. And we'll be talking a little bit about, when you do the evaluation check. And we get into Kirkpatrick a little bit later. We'll be talking about some sort of different levels. And certainly what you ask somebody at the end of a session may be very different from their impression a week or a month or 3 months down the road. Did people find the training useful? Some good inputs here. Okay, I'm going to capture some of these, and then we'll come back to some of those a bit later as well. So just sort of an official evaluation and a definition, and I pulled this from Wikipedia. Evaluation is a systematic determination of a subject's merit, worth, and significance using criteria governed by a set of standards. The primary purpose of evaluation, in addition to gaining insight into prior or existing initiatives, is to enable reflection and assist in the identification of future change. And someone was commenting earlier, how do you know for the next time what you can do to improve it? So you'll notice in that definition that value is really at the heart of evaluation. What value is this bringing? And there is definitely a factor of judgment. And one of the things that you may need to think about is, how is it being judged? What are the standards by which you're gauging it? Through some sort of systematic determination. And it can have both flavors of both proving something, how did we do, that objective quality that Vicki was asking for, which is typically called sort of a summative evaluation. How do we actually know? Or improve, a formative evaluation in order to get input to make something better, to do better the next time. So there's kind of a couple of different focuses within the word. Now, this particular webinar was couched as training evaluation because, of course, evaluation can apply to lots of different situations. We can evaluate technical documentation. We could evaluate programs of various sorts, informal, more formal. But today we're a bit focused specifically on training. So in your context, what is training? Is it a single event? Is it a process of change that occurs over time where people are developing skills? Do you think about, sort of an e-learning module or an instructor-led course? What's for where you work? How do you think about training? Instructor-led, e-learning, blended, okay. Both e-learning, module, instructor-led course, can be all of those things. Okay, usually a single instructor-led event. Over an hour or up to 2 days. Getting into video, okay. So it sounds like most of these, however, are events rather than a process. Is that true? Is anybody in the situation where they actually get to help people sort of develop over a period of time that might require a number of courses or some checking back? New hire training, very key actually for getting people established. Yep, can be on the job training. Yeah, so Amy, there'll be an interesting one to think about that may be an interesting one to think about today as we're talking about this. So really, if it's successful, if your new hire training is successful, how does that contribute to the people who are being integrated into your company? Okay, Nikki says, instructor-led followed up with user manuals. Okay, yep, so considering other kinds of information that will help people learn. Good, okay, thank you. So our focus today is we're going to talk about evaluation of training from 3 points of view. First is just really, is training actually the right solution? If not, it can be the most perfect training in the world, and that may not matter. We're going to talk a little bit about Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation, and then we're going to talk a bit about a program evaluation approach, which cuts in from kind of a different angle. And the caveat, of course, is, at this point we've got a little more than an hour. So really we're going to be sort of getting our feet wet about these 3 different things and doing an overview. In reality, evaluation, as it turns out, is a whole discipline and field. People get PhDs in it. There's a professional association called the American Evaluation Association, which is huge. And it has its own collection of special interest groups. They call them technical interest groups, but much like STC, only with a different broad area of specialization. So we're going to be diving into some of those ideas today and thinking about how to put them to use in the contexts that we all work in. What we won't talk about today is the sort of how am I doing in the stuff that I'm creating? So do I have clear instructional objectives? Does my content support the objectives? So we're going to assume for today that you've got the mechanics of that piece pretty well down. We could do that sort of an evaluation or analysis, but the concepts we're going to cover today are not in that direction. Although, of course, what you learn in an evaluation may well point to things that you could improve in the particular course content itself, but it's not where our focus for today is. So I suspect that most of you are familiar with the sort of ADDIE concepts: analysis, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. It's something that's used in a lot of instructional design and other kind of design situations, actually. And in this model, evaluate tends to be talked about as being at the end. Although in reality, it may make more sense to think of it as an iterative piece of that cycle. because as you get to know the needs of a situation, as you design and develop instruction or information and roll it out to people, each one of those phases can be evaluated, and you can gather input to help you improve the particular way you're working then and also the particular development of the solution that you're working on. So we could really talk about it at any of those stages. Today we're going to focus mostly on the analysis and implement stages. Analysis when you're confirming the need, confirming what the desired performance is, and making sure that training is the right solution. After implementation, once it's been rolled out, it's complete and it's being used to see, is it accomplished? Is it accomplishing, or has it accomplished what it should? And we'll talk a little bit about, during design and development, the kinds of things that you might think about if you start out and include in your thinking evaluation thinking throughout. So the kinds of questions, thinking down the road, how am I going to know whether what I'm doing is meeting the need? So let's take the first of those and talk a little bit about just whether training is actually the right solution. In my own experience and from people I talk to, a lot of the times we get charged or asked to develop training or to develop information, and that's how it's presented to us. It's the fait accompli. We need a training course. We need an e-learning module. People need to learn to do this. Please create it. And when approached that way, if we don't step back and ask ourselves and ask our client or our manager or our stakeholders in the process, what is it you really want from this? We could wind up going off and developing a beautiful module or instructor-led session that's really not of much use. So a key question is really, do you know what the change is that's desired? And one way to think about training is that really what it does is implement some sort of change. It might be a small change. People need to learn a new idea. It might be a bigger change. People need to learn to work in a new way or use a new piece of software or hardware. That there's some kind of change in that process. And also, is there a clear performance gap? So when they're done with the training that you develop or the series of training pieces that you're putting together, what is the particular change? So what's it like now? What do you want it to be like in the future? What's the gap that you're going to be filling with the instruction that you're developing? And to think, is training actually the right approach to close that gap? And I'm going to give a couple more slides, but I'd encourage you also to type in chat with examples of this where you need to think about that particular question. Because a lot of factors impact performance. And I don't know how many of you may be familiar with Thomas Gilbert's behavior engineering model. If you're not, it's quite interesting. He actually developed it in the 90s. You'll see the reference at the bottom is from a version of a book that was republished in 2007. But he presents the situations about things that impact performance along the two rows shown here. So on the bottom is actually the person, the things that help them carry out particular tasks, perform their job in particular ways. And some of that is what they know, if they have the knowledge and skills, if they've had the training that's needed. Some of it is just their capacity. Are they actually able, mentally and physically, to do the work that's being asked of them? And then are they motivated? So those are things that all have to do with what's in the person. But the person's in an environment, and there's lots of things that in the environment that impact their performance. Do they have clear expectations? Do they know what is expected of them? Are there guides to their performance where someone has said, we want you to work in this way, or we want you to use this tool in order to be able to complete your travel report, or to log your hours, or to request vacation time, or to captivate, or whatever it might be. Are there clear guides to performance? Do they get feedback? Do people tell them how they're doing, that they're doing their job right, or that they're not doing it correctly? Do they have the tools and materials that they need to actually do it? And are they motivated? You know, is there incentive there? There's some sort of consequences if they don't do it that way. You know, might they be de-incentivized? So, for example, let's say you've got a new system at work and you now need to record your hours in a particular way, or you know, set up your performance expectations for the next year, and you need to complete this form. But the software is so difficult to use that people avoid it and don't actually use it correctly. So they might know how to use it. They might have even attended training, but if it's so cumbersome, they may not have an incentive. So it's really sort of a mixed bag of things that impact whether or not somebody's going to be behaving in the way that's desired. So training really addresses that box down on the bottom, but you can have terrific training and not have it help. So I'd be curious to hear, do you feel when you're asked to develop training that it's actually targeting a need? And I see that we've got some good discussion in chat. And Vicki says, learn a new software program without calling me or emailing me. Okay, so it sounds like you were the, in this case, you're sort of the customer support person?
Yeah, well, after you do a training, people sort of trust you, you know, and they have your name and you have theirs. And so people tend to go the path of least resistance, and sometimes they just pick up the phone, and then I help them read the screen, and then they're back on their way.
Uh-huh. And so, and your thinking in that regard is you'd like the training to be enough that they didn't need to do that?
Yes, if they had enough confidence to click around a little, do some experiments, not really need the safety net. Because I think when you reach out to a human, you're pretty desperate, right?
Uh-huh. Well, it depends, actually. Sometimes that's people's preference.
That's true.
Yeah. So Melissa says, you see companies who know that training is needed but don't want to spend the time to assess what training. Yep. Yep, the guy in charge says, I know what's needed, do it. Right, so the problem there, of course, is, and Robert says, he's been asked to make training to fix other problems. In one case, he was able to train management a little bit and make a difference. Uh-huh. So in that case, was the training actually needed?
Sorry, I was muted there. Training was needed too, but the biggest problems in that case were like environmental problems that you were talking about, and just an unpleasant environment, really, more than anything else.
Uh-huh. Right. So you could give them spectacular training, but if the environment is unpleasant, it may not be put to use. Or
exactly.
If it's put to use, it may not result in the change.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So I think it behooves us to ask when we take a project on, what's really the desired change, and is training going to do it, and is training enough? You know, and I think you know, if it's not the right solution, we could evaluate it as to whether it's well designed, but that in itself may not matter either. But I think the other thing is to think what else is needed to support the change. And that's really the point that you were just making, Robert. You know, so maybe they need training, but maybe they also need clear expectations. Okay, so Vicki's saying, Betty, I love the term voluntold, so I think I missed something further up. Most people in my webinar self-select into the class, although some are voluntold. Yep. That is a good term. So it's worth asking, is it the right solution? And it's worth, my slides went back. And what else is needed? Because the other thing, of course, that happens is here you are in a webinar or maybe even a more intense training of some sort. So that's well and good. Maybe it's interesting. Maybe it actually applies. But when you get back on the job, are you given the opportunity? Do you have the materials that you need? Do you have the support from your supervisor to actually make the change that's desired? Do you have are you motivated by the environment? Are you incentivized by the environment? So although we may want to evaluate training in a particular sense, something particular that we're working on, it can be useful to think of training as a training system. Alison Rossett calls it sometimes a solution system, and really to think what's required, recognizing that our training is part of a bigger system and there's other pieces in play, and to think about what else may need to be there. And if you don't know Alison Rossett's work, it's pretty interesting, and there's a book at the bottom that you could explore if you like. Okay, so let's shift a little bit and talk about Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation. And before I get into this, could you raise your hand if this is something that you're quite familiar with already? Sort of, if you put yourself in the yes, quite familiar, I know this and have read lots about it category. Okay, so Amy, Melissa's saying not familiar with. Okay. Betty would like a refresher. Good, that's about what we're going to get to today. Somewhat, Jamie says. Nikki, not familiar. James, not familiar. Okay, so this is new to some people. Okay, so Donald Kirkpatrick was a pretty interesting guy. He first developed his ideas in the early 90s. It might have even been the 80s if we hunted to the very earliest stuff. It came out of actually his PhD work. But he wound up developing something that is today referred to as a 4-level model. And the levels are reaction, how was the training received? And that's the sort of common piece where you sort of might have one of these, what are sometimes referred to as smiley sheets that happen at the end of training, the kinds of questions that Vicki was saying she likes to ask. You know, do you feel confident? Did you learn what you needed to hear? Was it well organized? You know, on a scale of 1 to 5, would you recommend this to other people? Those kinds of things. It's asking somebody's reaction. So how was it received? Learning. Did people actually master what it was intended that they master? And learning is very often gauged during the training or sometimes right after, although this can come later. Did they learn it? So a test is most common, or perhaps something where they have to actually implement what they learned, and people do a check and see, yes, I see that you're using the ideas, the techniques, the software that you used. Behavior, this is sort of back on the job, so are they actually using what they learned? So they get sent to a training, whether it's a software training or an ethics training or how to complete your performance goals training, whatever it might be. But when they're back at work, are they actually making use of that? And again, we could ask on a timeline, when are they using it? A week out, a month out, 3 months out. One of the ways that I work with teams a lot is in learning something called topic-based authoring for technical writing teams who are shifting to a new way of writing. And I do a 2-day workshop, and they get lots of practice. But can they go back and, the next week know how to apply that stuff? And sometimes we do checks, months down the road, did it stick? Where do they still need help? So what's the behavior that's happening back on the job? And then the 4th level is really thinking about results in a bigger picture for why does that behavior change matter to the organization? Has the intended change materialized either in the workplace or for the organization? So thinking again for this topic-based authoring piece, a lot of times people go into this. You might have heard the term DITA, which is a structured way of implementing it. And one of their wishes perhaps is that going to a new process is going to reduce translation costs, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why that might be the case. But if that's really what drove the decision, so 6 months, a year down the road, are they seeing reduced translation costs? So to do the sort of check of saying, was that new training that people went through, has it actually materialized? And so I'm curious, so when you think about that, and just a note that these are talked about as levels and in this order, but they're not necessarily done in order. And it can be useful to think about them backwards with your training, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. But just sort of a quick little poll. So how many of you right now, at the end of a course that you're doing or the end of a session, do some sort of a reaction training? So you give them some sort of a survey or some sort of a question. And okay, so we've got a couple people raising their hands. Sometimes, yes, okay, so Melissa for chapter events and training, survey after training, occasionally, Amy says, okay. Okay, Betty's clients give them, okay, James gives a 2-page survey. NPS, what's an NPS score, James? Net Promoter Score, okay. Okay, so it sounds like mostly this is something that people do on a regular basis. Not necessarily always, but a lot of the time. How about learning? Assessments of various types. How many of you actually include something to gauge whether or not people learned the content? Nope, says James. Nina, is that a new hand raised for you? Yes, okay. So you get a chance to assess their what they've learned. Okay, Amy has a certification program. Okay, with requirement. Okay, 80% passing grade required. Vicki says sometimes there's a quiz. And a prize. Okay, a prize if they learn it. Okay, so I'm curious now, when you do the assessments, so Amy's, it sounds like, might be further down the road from just having done it. And Nikki says not formally. Okay, so there's an informal passing on if someone's not getting it to the client. Amy says right after the course. Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask. So is the learner assessment right after the course, or is it done further down the road? Anybody doing the assessment further down the road rather than right after? That might be interesting. Okay, so Amy says sometimes at the end of classroom training, at the end of online training. One training program that has 4 levels. So does that mean, Vicki, does that mean like 4 pieces of the training?
Sorry, I have to, it takes me a while to get off mute. We have one set of training that you do 4 hours in the classroom and then you get 1 level. And then you do 4 hours of practice sessions and then you get another level. And then you use the tool for a certain amount of projects in your normal job, get a 3rd level. And then if you become proficient to the point that you can teach others, then you get a 4th level. And of course, we like music where I am, so the levels are gold, platinum, double platinum, and Grammy.
Okay. And so Nina's asking about levels referring to mastery levels. So it sounds like in your case they do.
Yes.
Yep. And Betty's saying she wishes that they would do it down the road. Yes, it's challenging. People often do not want to pay for it. And I think people working as an external consultant often experience that. They're at least is the potential, I would hope, for people working internal to adopt or encourage a culture where there's additional testing further down the road. In terms of Kirkpatrick's levels, it does not refer to mastery. And I think so there's some confusion around the use of the word level when people talk about it and when they talk about the Kirkpatrick model, because it isn't necessarily progressive. They can be entirely different. And reaction in terms of how somebody feels about an experience, a learning experience, does not necessarily mean that they can make use of the information. So just between those two, you can see there's a bit of a difference. How about behavior, actually putting the learning to use on the job? And so it sounds like, Vicki, in your case, you've got one where that's done. Has anybody else worked in a situation where you actually get to either work with the management or the supervisors to come in and see, is there an impact in terms of the desired change on the job? Okay, got plenty of people typing. Okay, Robert says he has, but not in a very organized way. So do you sort of wander over and inquire? Just observation. So observation can be very useful. It doesn't have to be a big formal thing. I think where it can be helpful when it's more formal is then you've got information that you can relay to whoever, not only to the people involved in developing the training, but to the people who asked for it, to the clients and the stakeholders involved, to confirm for them that it's actually worth it. People were doing this. You didn't want that. We gave them this training. Now, in fact, there's been a change. And of course, other things may impact that change as well. If we go back to the behavior engineering model, there's a lot of factors that can play into something. But it's at least one check, and then you could do sort of some further analysis and assessment to see, is it the training that's actually contributing to that change? Okay, so Nina is saying when she trains people to use Captivate, okay, so she observes. So you observe it in the class. That's part of the assessment. If you see a lot of support calls, you plan a follow-up group training. Okay, so Nikki, that sounds useful. Okay, so Nina is in an interesting case. So there you are teaching. You can make sure that they can do it, and that's really the sort of learning assessment piece. So then the question is to find out, are they back on the job? And again, it's a level in that you would have additional knowledge, but it's not necessarily, it's not necessarily a hierarchical level going up. But it's the kind of question that, particularly if you're developing training materials that are used by an external customer, it's very hard to get a glimpse into their businesses often to know, are you actually making the difference? Okay, Amy says they observe about a month after initial training. Okay, that's great. So Amy, out of curiosity, are you in a learning and development? So do you work for a group that has a title, something like learning and development? Couple people typing. Okay, so while I'm waiting for responses to appear, so Nikki, it sounds like you're able to use the support calls as a way to gauge whether the training was effective, which is wonderful. So it tells you are additional resources needed, and could also be used to sort of go back and improve if there's some things that are not sticking. Okay, Amy says she's part of a team of 2 instructional designers. Okay, shared services. That's interesting. The training department, yeah. So it's great that you can go out and observe to have it integrated in that way. I think you can add a lot of value. And then is anybody doing any sort of results? Now, so sometimes this is described as return on investment or ROI, but where really a company is coming back and saying, okay, we did that training. What's the benefit? Has anybody had a chance to be involved in that sort of activity? Okay, so Nina, I see. So you get called back to assist with next steps. So you're integrated. So you get to essentially help guide the transfer of learning from the training environment out into the workplace. So that's a wonderful situation to be in. It's not exactly evaluation per se, but really it sounds like the learning activity is integrated with the change activity. So you're involved in facilitating a change, not just in being asked to deliver a training. Great. Okay, so the stuff Kirkpatrick has now passed on, but his son and I believe daughter-in-law have carried on his business. They've got elaborate trainings and information actually about using these different levels and how to use them. The last slide in here has some reference links on it, so if you want to dive into information, it's back there. And the PDF that has all the links in it is also coming your way. I think that Vicki's put it on the website, and we'll be sending you a link to it. So there's also sometimes some criticisms of his ideas, but really thinking about them, and the criticisms have to do with them being limited in various ways and people trying to make it too much of a linear level model, and I think that misses the point in many ways. We can think about each of these things as providing different useful information. So it's definitely a model that I think is worth checking into and learning more about. And it's also something that you can use the ideas to plan your training with the success in mind. So to get really clear on all those levels of what's success going to look like. So if you were going to go and say, 3 months from now, after people take my training, what are they going to be doing in the workplace that's different from what they were doing now? A year from now, what's the change? So why are they bothering with this training? What's the change that the business would like to see as a result of this training? And define that success, and then you can start to look at your training. How will you know? Then you can start to look at your training and say, what can I build in to put the building blocks in place to make that happen? And so in that way, that can, I think, really inform our design. And then the evaluation can become, how close did we get to that? So if you've got the goal that at 3 months we want people to be behaving like this, then you can go at the 3-month mark and say, well, are they? And how close or far are they? What else can we do to improve? And some of those improvements might be in the actual training session, but maybe there are also some things that have to do with helping people transfer the training back to the learning environment. Maybe they could use some additional documentation or performance support. Maybe they could use a supervisor who actually encourages them and says, hey, are you able to make this change? Are you using what was talked about? So there can be some strategies to think about how do we actually close that gap after the training. So there's some interesting questions that they bring up that really starts to begin to pull the ideas of evaluation into development that can be pretty interesting. Okay, so I'm going to move ahead a little bit from this just so that we can have a little bit more discussion at the end, just watching the time. But actually, let's just take a minute for reflection. So when you think about this, from what we've been talking about now, what occurs to you that you might be able to use of the Kirkpatrick's levels in your work, either doing the analysis of getting ready to develop training, during the design and development, after implementation. What occurs to you personally that that you might be able to put to use? Needs analysis, Amy says. And can you write a sentence about what that might mean to you? Is there a question that you might ask differently? Or that you might include in your needs analysis? Nikki says, establish the desired result with the client and work backward. Yep. What does success look like, says Amy? Yep, that's a really important question, I think. Betty says, evaluate the learning after the course is over. Needs analysis comes from reading their writing samples before the course. Okay, so that's you doing a very close analysis. Better focus when designing for success. Yes, and you know, Robert, to me that gets back to that idea of figuring out what's the performance gap. You know, what's there now, and what's desired. Desired outcome. Yep. Yep. Very good questions to get into that early discussion. Vicki says, can the learner use the new tool in a real-world application, not just a practice exercise? Okay, plan ahead for immediate use. Yes. Yeah, so there's a really interesting book, and I'm probably going to forget the name of the authors, but on transfer of training, and I can dig it out later. It's not a new book. It might have even been written in the 90s, but it's not very long, and it's got some really great ideas like that have to do with getting exercises, getting activities, getting follow-on discussions into the workflow in a way that help ensure that people are putting what they've learned to use. Okay, I'm going to skip through that one, and let's move on a little bit to think about something pretty different from my point of view. It was certainly new to me in learning about it. And it's really the idea of program evaluation. And to me, this brings in a really different way to think about evaluation. And these are based on ideas from Michael Scriven, who's been in the field for decades now. Jane Davidson, who has also, but who took his ideas and captured them and expanded on them in a really nice little book called Evaluation Methodology Basics, and lots of other people write about program evaluation as well. And Yanni Chung consolidated a lot of these ideas into an article that's, you can see at the bottom of the screen, and right now there's an open link to the journal article. I don't know how long it's going to remain open, but you can actually get it at this point, that pulls together a lot of ideas from program evaluation in a really nice way. And she was one of my faculty at the Boise State program on organizational performance and workplace learning, and has done a really nice job of putting that stuff together. So if you get intrigued by this, I recommend that article. So program evaluation helps think about a particular program in the larger system in which it sits. And in a way, we've been talking about that with the ideas of looking at the environment as well as the person. But program evaluation as a field looks at a huge range of programs. And we can think about it specifically for training, but it could be almost anything. It could be your power company's attempts to get people to use energy more efficiently. The things that may be encouraging you to, in California for us where we have a drought, it's the utilities trying to get people to save water and use it more effectively. So there can be a program in place that have lots of moving parts. So the program can be quite broad. But there's lots of programs where really you look to say, is this program being effective? Is it providing the value that it needs to? And inherent is the idea that you start by clarifying what it is you want to know. And that's a little bit more of a nuanced idea for me than learning or behavior or even results, because with it comes the idea that we're not just evaluating this training that we put together or this e-learning or this webinar, but that we can say, what is it that we want to know about the program? What is it that we want to know about a change in behavior? That it's not all or nothing, that it's not just what was learned, but that begins with the question of saying, well, what is it that we want to know about that? And you know, it's not all a matter of sort of all or nothing. And so it starts with the idea of what is it that's being evaluated, so identifying what gets referred to in this lingo as the evaluand. And in our context for training, it would probably be a training program. But that training program might be the course itself, or it might be a series of courses, or it might be a change process that's trying to implement a change in a business or a behavior or a workflow of which a particular training module is a piece. And so it starts with thinking about what is it that we want to evaluate, and what do you want to learn from the evaluation itself. So in that process, you might think about the goals for the program. You might think about, are you focused on improving that program or assessing the outcomes, or both? You might think about what are big evaluation questions, so what's most important to know, and what are the criteria we'll use. So how are you going to know? So for example, Betty mentioned that it sounded like she's doing some writing training because she does a needs assessment where she's looking at writing samples that people have at the beginning. So if you were evaluating the change in writing that's desired, do you want to evaluate your program? The particular workshop that you're doing? Do you want to evaluate whether people have made a change down the road? So the context in which you are giving this workshop, the change that's desired by the client in terms of the writing skills change. And where's the focus? Is it on improving a particular workshop, or is it on improving what the output of people is at the end, or is it, further down from that? So where is the focus for this? Because with that comes the ability, when you start to really think, what do I want to know, then how you gather the information to know that is going to change. And so it comes in, how am I going to get the data that I need? The sort of reaction question on the first level from Kirkpatrick is most often a little survey, although it sounded like from a couple of people, they might just grab somebody at the end and ask them questions to get their confidence level. Okay, so Betty, I see your comment about getting people to participate. Well, so I'm going to save that one for a minute. Very good point. So how are you going to get the data? And actually, so there's the end of course survey, for example. Hard enough to get information from them later. So really the question then becomes, who else needs to be involved in helping you gather that data? And it's clearly, there have to be messages within the organization that the data matters, that the training mattered, that the change in behavior mattered. And with that is probably going to come encouragement to fill out surveys, to have another assessment down the road, to do interviews. So you really need to kind of think about what methods, how are you going to get access to the people as part of those methods, what the questions are that will tell you. And maybe Robert was mentioning observation. So part of the methods may be observation of being out on site. Are they doing things differently than they used to? And who will you survey or interview? What kinds of documents or records will you review? So in the case of these topic-based authoring workshops, so one possibility would be, can I go and look at their content a year down the road, or have my client look at their content and see, has there actually been a change in how people are in the output? Checking in a shorter term, it might be going and looking at drafts that people are creating. Has it actually changed? So to decide, where do you really want to focus? And you notice many of these things are focused not just on the session itself, thinking about, are they learning it in the session, but further down the road. And both of those can be evaluated. It's not that what's taught in the session shouldn't be considered. Absolutely it needs to be considered. But what you're focused on there is a shorter-term piece. Can they access the information during the session? Can they, during the session, use the skills that are being taught there to the level that's desired? But then also what happens later on. So it's different questions. And in some cases, you might mostly be focused on just improving the course experience. And in other cases, you might be focused on what's the behavior change 3 months down the road. So the idea of program evaluation gets you to actually think about, okay, I'm going to take the time to evaluate. Well, which of these things matter the most? And it's often not either or. You often may have a series of things, but you may also have to evaluate which things matter more because resources are limited. James is saying, yes, you start with what data is available, then assume that's what's important. Yeah, very easy to do that. And so what's the question? You need to start with the question. What is it that you actually want to know? Then how can you find out? And often it's not necessarily a short process, and absolutely it requires getting stakeholders and supporters involved who will confirm for you and help you support that, yes, it's important to get this data and that it's worth people's time to actually provide it. Once you've got the data, then there's analysis involved. So you need to actually review the data, triangulate it, which essentially means that you confirm that you're getting similar information across multiple points of view, or you want to look to see, so you get one very squeaky wheel where the other people echoing the same kinds of problems or concerns, or not. Are they an outlier? So to look across and make sure that you're getting a range of data and to analyze it and see what are the messages that are coming through. And then once you've analyzed it, summarizing it and actually making the judgments. And that judgments piece is a little, it clearly needs to not just be subjective. It needs to be transparent and explicit about how are you evaluating it. What's good enough? Are you looking for, and often this involving clients and stakeholders to reach agreement and say, what's the most important part? Is the most important part that people go home from the training and they're excited about using the product? Is the most important part that 3 months down the road they are doing work differently? Is the most important part that they got really excited about the product and told 25 friends about it? So the criteria for what success is going to look like needs to be thought about in advance, and then those criteria are used to assess the judgment. So was this actually a worthwhile session? Was it worthwhile from the, if you ask people at the end of a session from a reaction standpoint, did they like it? You may get one answer. Are they using it? And does their supervisor see them use it? You may get a different answer. So which of those are you caring most about, that people are happy at the end? It's not that that's not important, but it's a different question and a different answer than are they actually making use of it further down the road. And then thinking about the specific recommended changes based on that. So, okay, Melissa's stepping out. Totally understand. See you later. But so the process of sort of going through and thinking about program evaluation in this way is a much more elaborate process than saying, okay, I'm going to do a quick check at the end, or let's check in a month and see, are they using this? So it's a way to bring in some different thinking that I've found quite useful for how to evaluate. And it can be a very formal evaluation, but the ideas can also be can help in thinking about the process of implementing training in a system in which it's being used. In particular, the questions about what do you want to learn and how are you going to learn it are the things that program evaluation was sort of really an eye-opener to me, that it wasn't just a matter of thinking, oh, we see if people are satisfied, oh, we see if people learn it, but that actually there may be other things to be learned from an evaluation and that it's important to actually think about that. So there's a design piece for evaluation just as there is for instruction. Okay, so I've been talking a lot, so let me just pause for a minute and give people a chance to comment or ask questions if you have them. Not seeing typing, so I'm going to go ahead, and if things occur to you, please feel free to type them in. So when you think about evaluating a training program that you've created, what do you most want to know? And so let's just take that one for starters. So if you just reflect for a minute on a training program or a session that you've created, what do you, and maybe get a very specific one in mind, what do you really want to know about that training program? Robert says, is it effective? Okay, so for you, Robert, what would effective look like? Or you could sort of go on to the next question. What kinds of questions would you have to find out? Would you have to ask in order to know if it's effective? Meeting success goals. James says, am I presenting at the right level for this audience? Okay, so that's an interesting one. Are people confident in using a new system or process in their daily work? Have they made it past the point where they're afraid of or angry at the software? Okay, so right, that hurdle of getting into it, actually, that hurdle that prevents people from using it.
And that point happens right before it all clicks and they begin to use it. But
yep,
I like it when they're past that point.
Yep. If the learner has enough info to do what they need to do. Can people write more clearly? Okay, so what kinds of questions do you have to ask to find out? Or what other data will be needed to answer your question? So that's the companion piece, is to think about, okay, here's what I want to know, so how am I going to find it out? And if you each just take sort of the example that you had in mind, a decrease in support calls with an increase in use. Okay, yep. Okay, so interesting. So that's so then the next question becomes, how do you learn that? And for the moment, let's just imagine that that you have the resources that you need. So if you wanted to ask these questions, that you could actually get to the people or get people to respond. Okay, so Betty says ask their manager. Okay. Vicki says we track support informally. Okay. Review their writing again 3 months later. Yep. So that would be getting later samples in a way. Interviews, observation, production metrics. Right, Amy says observe users doing their task, compare stats from previous systems to those in the new system. Yep, really good ideas, lots of different things. And in some cases, you might be able to gather data, and others you may need to really be out there with people. Okay, good ideas. I'm going to move ahead a little bit to cover a few more slides. Okay, so Jamie, just take one more thought before we do that. So Jamie's saying, ask a hypothetical question. What would you do in X situation? Yep. So, and you could do that during a training. You could also do it after a training to sort of gauge. Okay, so one of the ideas that's, or sort of techniques, methods that's used in program evaluation is to develop something that's called a logic model. And what this does is help you think through, or what it can do, help you think through what's important. And in many ways, it's useful to think about this going from right to left rather than left to right. So, we were talking earlier about desired outcomes. And really the ultimate end of that is the impact. So the eventual impacts from the event or training that this contributes to. So what's the down the road ultimate impact for the company or for the person of having been through this training? And feeding into that might be outcomes at a series of intervals. So short term might be within a year, or maybe in your case it's shorter, it could be 3 months. Intermediate, 1 to 3 years, long term, 4 to 6 years. So it's sort of thinking at different levels what outcomes are expected going forward. So Betty, you're helping people write better. So what do you expect them to do a month after your workshop? What about 3 months? What about a year? So your outcome levels might be different than shown here. And eventually, when people have sort of really mastered the change and implemented it for a while, what's the impact going to be for the company? What's the benefit? To get to those outcomes, that's sort of the outcomes and impacts pieces. The first 3 things on this slide, resources, activities, and outputs, really relate more to the specific event itself. And so you're going to have resources that help you develop the event, so the pieces that you need to develop and conduct the training. And so that might be, budget money. It might be people to help you. It might be software that you need in order to develop it. It might be access to experts, different sorts of resources in order for the program or the training itself to take place. And then the activities are the place where, sorry about that, where the actual training pieces take place. So you develop the training, you probably do a needs assessment in advance, you develop the actual training, you recruit the people who are going to participate in it and get them to sign up. They come and attend the training. You conduct an assessment and a reaction possibly at the end of that. So these are activities around the training itself or the event. And the outputs from that, the specific outputs are, at the end of that, you've got X number of people who've been through this training. Maybe it's 7 or 8 people who are on this webinar today. Maybe it's 35 people who've attended an e-learning module. Maybe it's 25 people in a workshop space who are meeting there together. So that's one output, just the fact of people who have attended that. There may be additional outputs as well. Maybe they've created specific things as a result of that. You may have scores. So the framework of this helps you think about, or can be used to think about, where does your training fit into the big picture, what's needed in order to create it, and what's going to move down the line. And then I have an example of a logic model that for a 3-day program. So this was this was something that I worked on with a couple of teammates. It was actually done in a graduate course, but we spent 3 months doing an evaluation of a particular program. So it was really wearing an evaluator hat as opposed to an evaluator hat in addition to also doing the development, which I know many of us are often in that position. But in this case, we were looking at a 3-day program that was provided to graduate students who were helping on a research project, and to see was that 3-day weekend that they were sent to actually useful. And you can see over here the resources that went into that 3-day workshop, the activities that were involved in the workshop, the outputs from the workshop, and then the desired outcomes within a year, further down the road, and the ultimate impacts that were involved. This is actually a diagram that we developed with the people who put together the workshop, and the sort of our stakeholders and clients who cared about it and who knew the ultimate outcome. And where this fit, these graduate students were part of a 5-year program working on climate change adaptation in an agricultural situation. So they were there to be integrated into the product and into the project and to learn a fair amount about the project itself, but also to begin to develop some skills that they were going to be using over that 5-year program. And so the outputs were just sort of at the end of the training piece. There were some specific things that were desired, but ultimately the goals for the organization were that were very, many and varied, but included having developed professionals who had built a stronger ability to collaborate, to work with other people, as well as having learned the science and contributed to this project. So here we are doing an evaluation of this workshop, and the workshop had just happened. And so our focus, we mapped out this whole piece for them to actually look at the big picture. But then when we said, okay, what can we evaluate at a 3-month mark, we could then focus in and say, okay, here's what we can learn. And we didn't pick everything. We picked things that would make sense and would help our client. So we focused on looking at the actual sessions during the retreat. At the end of the retreat, there was a bunch of feedback that came out from the students to the staff. So there were action items that people took on. So we focused on where those action items addressed. And then we looked at 3 criteria, and we worked really closely with our stakeholders to see which ones they cared about. And what they decided they cared about were, did these graduate students understand how their work was going to fit within the overall picture? Was there increased communication? That was one of the hopes that this workshop would lead to, so did it result in that? And was there increased collaboration? So of all the things we could have looked at, we focused on those, and then we wound up developing surveys and interviews to help us learn that. So these models, it looks complex, but can be done pretty simply, and I found them to be a really sort of interesting way of thinking about things. And so if you want to know about that particular case study, there's a link to it. There's also a link to the Kellogg Foundation, which has tons of information about how to develop logic models and how to think about them. So let me pause and take questions, reactions, thoughts. Does this look like something that you could put to use in your own work? Ideas from this that might be useful. Or questions? I see Amy is typing. A couple of people Amy says, I think it will be useful, but we'll take some thought. Yep, absolutely. Checking back long after the training. Uh-huh. And so, Vicki, you might also think about how long out you want to check back. You know, for you and your stakeholders, what are the pieces that matter? You know, we can't evaluate everything, so what's the most useful to know? Robert likes the idea of looking at intermediate outcomes and goals. Okay, bringing the two together. Okay, so the Kirkpatrick and the model. Okay. Hold that thought, Amy. We'll get there in a second. James is saying, not sure how I would distinguish long-term impact from other impacts. Yes. So we're, and there's a lot of discussion actually in the literature about how do you ferret out exactly what's contributing. It's very hard to do that. So I think the more important question is to realize the links, because ideally the work that we're doing, the trainings that we're developing, and the other kinds of learning pieces that we may be developing for people should be aligned to the output. So sometimes just starting with the alignment to see, is this actually in line, and you know, does it seem to be contributing and moving in that direction? And then you could take some pieces, sort of come up with some questions and for surveys and possibly interviews to look and see where is the training itself having an impact. But yes, that's a very complicated question. Nikki says, this could be used to incorporate smaller goals of creating good learning content with the organization's overall change management big picture. Absolutely. And that's very well said, and I think that's a terrific opportunity, and it's a great way to sort of bridge conversations. And it could be a way to maybe talk to your change management folks to get a sense of the big picture, to be able to say, okay, here's where we fit in. Okay, so just to think a little bit, and I know that we're actually almost to the end of our time. So you could just think about where do the levels fit in. So really, Amy, when I put that on the slide, it's to think, if you go back to those 4 levels, so where is reaction going to fit in, right? So reaction, you're really gauging from people. So probably that's actually an activity that is part of this area, right, where you're actually just gauging from people right then what's their reaction. Learning, where could you do learning? Any ideas? How could you see? And you could, I'll just throw them all out there, but if we think about learning, how do you assess if people have learned? So where in this model might that fit? If you think about behavior, you want to see, is it making a difference on the ground, the training? So where could you gauge that? And ultimately results. You know, where would results fit? If we had more time, I'd wait for your comments, but I think clearly you can sort of see, you could ask learning at the end, you know, as one of the activities that you're doing with an event. You could also gauge learning into the outcome stages at different stages. So if you identify the periods of time that matter to you, 1 month, 3 months, 1 year, 3 years, whatever they might be, and you go and do an assessment of what they're doing, does it, you know, do they retain the knowledge that was taught? Are they making use of it? And the behavior pieces come in there. So one way to think about these two things is to realize that when you look at the levels from the Kirkpatrick and you look at something like a logic model, they can become sort of different sides to the conversation to help you think about how are we going to know this? Where are we going to know this? Amy says learning could be in the activities as well. Post-assessment, yep. Behavior with outcomes, results with impacts, absolutely. Okay. Okay, so we've talked about if training's the right solution. and making sure that that's the case for the identified problem or desired change. We've talked about Kirkpatrick's 4 levels. We talked about a program evaluation approach and really just hit a few of the sort of key ideas from that, including logic models. And I'd be curious, what are your impressions? Questions, thoughts, areas for your own further investigation? Okay, Betty's saying this has been a great overview, makes me want to learn more. I find it fascinating, and so there's thanks for the comments. It sounds like it's been useful. I certainly hope so. When you get the slides, there's ways to reach me, but there's also a resource slide. So I've tried to give you some ways to learn more. Hopefully the links will work. There's tons of stuff out there, and I'd be happy to discuss further, and I hope you'll also just enjoy exploring some of these and getting to know more about this stuff, because I think there's, I find it really interesting, and I found it really useful, so I hope it will be for you as well. Vicki, shall I hand it back to you? I don't know how much you want to toe to exactly the timeline. I'm happy to answer questions or talk a little more if people want to stay.
Yeah, well, we'll have Linda will remain on the line for questions if anyone has them. Since it is time to wrap up, I just want to thank everybody for your interest and your support. Especially, I want to thank Linda. We can go up here on our raise our hand thing and give applause. So I'm going to give some applause. And if you guys can find your applause button, see Jamie's giving some applause. Can't really hear us, but I hope that you really feel our appreciation. I think the time just flew by, and I have a load of follow-on questions for you. So you look for an email coming from me at about 3:30. It'll have the link to Linda's slides of the PDF, and I just checked. The links do work, so all of your references will
be
live. Yeah. We're also, of course, going to send you a survey, a satisfaction survey, to let us know what you thought of the training, what you thought of the time, that kind of thing. And our next, I should know this, our next webinar is in May. Yep, it's going to be May the 21st on Using Scenarios to Help People Learn by Kim Lindsay. So I hope to see all of you there. And I'm going to turn it back over to Linda. That way, if there are follow-on questions, we can get everybody's questions asked as long as our attention spans hold out. All right, Linda, back to you.
Okay. Okay, looks like most people need to sign off. So Vicki, do you want to stop the recording?